Thank you everyone for your patience. Thanks so much for joining this particular talk. And thank you also to UXDX for including this topic in this chapter of the UXDX conference. The fact that we are talking about this, about designing the conversation and gaining access to impacted people, is really a moment for us to pause and to reflect on why it is that after more than 20 years of digital really beginning to permeate our lives, we are still hungry to understand what other people's approaches and strategies are to ensure that those whose lives it is that we are going to impact are part of the design and research process, from concept idea through to product release and everything in between. My name is Bujuanes Livermore, and I work with Microsoft. I'm not sure if there's something in the fact that Microsoft and Zoom were doing something behind our backs and me not being able to access Zoom for a period of time, but we've got that sorted. I lead a team of designers and researchers in the space of human and AI experiences. And we work directly with customers on their data and AI ambitions. My team's comprised of talented designers and design researchers. And it'll be a little bit through that lens, there'll be a little bit of that flavor through some of the perspectives that I share with you today. In the spirit of context setting, I'll just start with a few definitions and sharing some perspective of the world that we find ourselves in. So firstly, what do we mean by impacted people? I much prefer to use the language of people over users. For me, users is very reductionary and very transactionary. And just to illustrate that point a little bit further, there would be a very different mental image conjured up for someone if I was to say that a person was a user of a hospital bed, as opposed to a person being in critical condition requiring in an intensive care unit. One very much engenders compassion and the other doesn't. And for that reason, it's our responsibility at every stage of a process to ensure that we're really humanizing the people who we are going to interfere with. Believe it or not, although we work for a technology company, we don't believe that technology is at the center of everything that we do. In fact, people are at the center of everything that we do, and technology is just one aspect of their lived experience. Yet we must recognize the power of technology is such that it can influence both positively and negatively someone's context and environment, their experience, their social influences, their cultural influences. And again, it's very much our responsibility as design researchers to ensure we're modeling and we're understanding what kind of impact is going to be had on a person once the solutions or experiences are that are going to be released to them. Further, when we talk about impacted people, it's very easy to identify those who are directly impacted. But technology now has permeated so many parts of our lives that there are many people who are consequently impacted. Sometimes people wouldn't even realize that they're being impacted at all. And again, that's yet another level of responsibility that I believe my team has to ensure that those people who are either directly or indirectly impacted are brought into the conversation and a part of our design and research process. So with that definition in place, I'll also just go to the way in which we view those who work on digital projects in terms of structure and work allocation. If we think of organizations that are out there, there are one of two ways that organizations can conduct work on their digital endeavors. Either they allocate the work to in-house teams, or they bring in vendors, service providers, partners, whatever the language is that you're familiar with. And it's in this particular area that we sit, and it's in this particular area that I see a lot of gap and a lot of obstruction, really, when it comes to gaining access to people who are going to be, again, impacted by the work that it is that we do. It's not as though this industry is an industry that we can be frivolous in. It's not as though this is an industry that we can snuff at. In fact, Gartner's estimations suggest that the industry will be valued at 4.5 trillion by the end of 2022. And given an industry that has that kind of a price tag, one might think that there would be more scrutiny, more checks and balances across how those who are going to be infected by the output of that industry have been incorporated into the design and research process. Yet that particular number is comprised of spend on hardware, spend on software, spend on IT services, spend on general cloud consulting services. The receipts really are missing for how much, even in terms of percentages, has been apportioned to ensuring that people are part of the process. So given that, we kind of, at different points in time, left to question, why is it hard? And exactly who is making it hard in this kind of a setup, in this kind of environment, to access people who will be impacted by technology, by our digital solutions. And in asking that question, we can't help but reflect on where we have come from. It's not as though we have been devoid of gargantuan efforts of a number of cohorts globally who have attempted to ensure that human rights take precedent over technology liberties. For example, we had WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, appear in the mid-1990s. They went on to create an ISO standard. And it was a remarkable moment to ensure that people could access content available digitally. In fact, the ability to access content digitally is considered a human right. We saw the emergence of digital service standards created at country levels. And those standards are a really good example of what it takes to not just define a standard, but to also back that up with criteria that will be assessed to ensure that that standard is upheld. So much for us to learn from countries that have done that well and who are on their journey of doing that today. We have seen data privacy laws felt most acutely through GDPR. And in this very emergent space that we're in right now, we see the drafting of particular AI laws and guidelines. While all of those frameworks target different things, they all have one thread of commonality, and that is that they all have sought to ensure human rights are maintained over technology liberties. And yet, despite all of this, it is still difficult to gain access to impacted people. So like any good researcher or simply anyone with a curious mind, we would do well to question whether there is actually anything wrong with what I would refer to as a technocentric or an algorithmic approach. These headlines are indicative of many headlines that I could have sourced across a number of industries. And really, I'm going to pose the question to you. Do you think that there's anything wrong with the fact that racial bias has been detected in an algorithm used to manage the health of populations? Do you find issue with the fact that job advertisements to men are more prestigious than job advertisements being fed to women? And do you think that there's anything problematic with something as novel as a chatbot spurting what is incredibly sensitive rhetoric to a group of people who have been through some critical life experiences throughout history? I'm sure that we share the same answer to those questions. But what typically happens when these headlines hit is that a company will either can the project, or suddenly they identify the need to have multiple disciplines come to the table and rethink version 2 or iteration 2 of that project. And like you, I would much prefer to be in a situation where I'm not responding to crisis, but instead am at the table up front, ensuring that we're planning the right approach from the beginning. And that leads us to this point, to discuss some of the strategies that have helped us along the way to help change the conversation. Those strategies for us really come down to the things that we have identified are in our control. And there are 3 things: the standards that we accept, the assumptions that we make, and the motivations that we design. The standards that we accept have been aided by artificial intelligence, believe it or not, and this is really a principle level discussion. The assumptions we make are things that we can make explicit through very simple processes instituted at the beginning of projects. And the motivations that we design is arguably about persuasive design. And while that has been associated with addictive behaviors, in this instance, we're looking to put some of those techniques to good use. So let's get stuck into all 3. Firstly, the standards that we accept. If your organization already has standards in place, fantastic. And if you were lucky enough to be part of the conversation, then you'll have known that standards have two parts. They're derived from principles, and these become the foundations for our actions. And they're aimed at achieving objectives which are a demonstration of principles. They become the compass. They help us ensure that we are pitching in the right direction with our efforts. Yet standards remain academic unless they are lit up by particular actions. For Microsoft, we have 6 AI principles. And those principles include fairness, inclusivity, reliability and safety, transparency, privacy and security, and accountability. In order to identify how we can do the work that we need to do and uphold these principles on a project-by-project basis, we need to go through the process ourselves of identifying the objective that we can push by holding up a principle and the activities or the enablers that help us maintain the accountability. So I'll just kind of go through a little bit of that to see how one of these principles turns up. I've chosen the principle of inclusivity, and we bring that to life by seeing our role in the organisation as helping with 2 objectives. 1, inclusivity enables us to include impacted people in the process, and 2 is around soliciting diverse representation. Again, slightly academic, unless we then support that with particular enablers or activities. So for us, it's helped to be enacted, it is enacted through the help of the creation of a research plan, a living research plan that updates itself and changes as we learn more about a space, the assignment of a research sponsor for the organisation that we are collaborating with. Once that sponsor has been assigned, the working with them and typically a wider group of people to co-identify impacted people. Through identifying those who are impacted, undertaking generative and evaluative research and design, and doing all of that in service to then gather the insights to feed into contributing to design decisions. So for us, the experience that we have had, and we are still very much on this journey, is to date that this helps us helps us light up the ability to be better in clearly communicating early on our terms of engagement with a customer that we're about to go into a tango with. It helps us provide consistent value-add messaging around our expectations. It helps us to have a very integrated project approach amongst disciplines, not just an engagement with a monodiscipline. And we are in the process at the moment to not, in the same way that I mentioned has been achieved by the digital service standards, to not just have those standards supported by actions, but to actually be accessible. Now, hopefully the standards that you have as an individual have some alignment to the standards that you have for the organisation that you're working for. And if not, you may be experiencing some existential crisis on the horizon. And I hope that doesn't happen to you. Now, secondly, the assumptions that we make. I'm going to go now from principles down to process level. And before I do that, I kind of just want to pause for a moment and have you think about that time that something was incorrectly assumed about you. How did it feel? I often find myself in those moments where I need to interact with a service organisation around customer service, and I need to provide my details and perhaps sometimes need to also provide my partner's details. And when I say the word partner, I'm often met with a reply of, okay, let's get your husband's details. I didn't say anything about a husband. And while it might have been something that I could overlook on one occasion, having 10 plus years of that happening over and over again leaves a very sour taste in my mouth for the organisation that I'm working with. It shows their lack of understanding about the diversity of the world that we live in. So while assumptions might not feel good for you when people make them about you, I'd say that they also are not a good idea to have on a project. Through this process of making assumptions very, very explicit, so many other good activities result. I mentioned that my team works across human and AI experiences, and in that world, we could generally cluster 5 different aspects in which assumptions relate. So like all technology projects, we can look at who is immediately impacted and who is consequently or secondarily impacted. We can look at the data, assumptions about the data that's being used. We also have an interest in understanding what assumptions have been created around the model that's to be created. And the area that I find is often missed is assumptions around the systems being impacted. This is more of a socio-technical conversation. Now, I'll present to you a bit of a fictitious scenario just to put into effect how some assumptions might result from learning about a customer who is potentially in the health and life sciences industry, that the scenario that they're interested in lighting up is improving early cancer detection rates or improving cancer detection rates earlier than what they're being detected at the moment. They're interested in doing that through a machine learning model, and they're interested in this being in place targeted to Western males. Admittedly, while that information is very scarce and there would be much more we would actually know about that particular scenario, I just want to pull out a couple of words from the small amount of words that are on the screen now and walk through some of our thinking about what might be assumptions we could extract from that. Firstly, around who is immediately impacted. I'm just looking at one very small slither of the conversation here. We hear the word male, and we must start questioning, in a world that is very fluid, what is actually meant by male. Are we talking about cis males? Do we have to call out that we feel as though we don't have enough significant data to discuss cis females or trans females or others? And this is a very real problem when it comes to technology companies, that they're often asked by other industries to work on projects that are yet to understand about themselves the fact that the data that's going to be used is skewed. When we see the word Western, many other questions emerge. For example, are we talking about males born in Pacific Western countries? Have they been born in the West but are now living elsewhere? Have they been born elsewhere but now are living in the West? What then happens from being able to explicitly state assumptions is we can then ensure that the team works through a risk factor if those assumptions aren't verified. And in this instance, at minimum, if the profile of the person the solution is to be targeted to is not understood, there will be incorrect diagnosis at best, morbidity at worst. So it's just a very, very slim slither of some of the assumptions that we could make or make explicit around the 2 words Western male. Then we can go to the model that's being created. And what we often see is companies who are looking for a proof of concept around a model when it comes to machine learning. And in that proof of concept, because they're eager to see results, they're often happy enough to not address the fact that the model has to provide transparency in its decision to clinicians, or in this instance to clinicians, or to whoever the target group is that the model is to be supporting. And also, given that there is a very specific data set for this scenario, we need to make explicit that the model will not be trained on any data outside of cis white men in Pacific Northwest, if that was an item that we had clarified. The risk, if unverified, for those 2 assumptions is that if we are not providing transparency around the decision-making process of a model, a lack of trust by clinicians in the results will transpire if there's an inadequate explanation. In terms of the data that's being trained, that's being used to train the model, anyone outside of the specified group has a higher chance of being misclassified. And again, misclassification can result in miscancer, which is a false negative, or unnecessary trauma, or even unnecessary medical treatment, a false positive. What we typically see as a result of going through risk identification for an assumption, the alignment of that risk to a responsible person, is that no one wants their name to be associated with a risk that had an opportunity to be explored. No one wants to be associated with the headlines that I referred to earlier. And for that reason, this process helps us then engage in an assumptions exploration phase. It helps us think more socio-technically and undertake more of a holistic system design. It helps set the team up with harms and risk modeling. And all of those items then are likely to ensure we access a greater network of impacted people. All really good things and all needed and responsible things for the kind of work and the kind of environments that our work affects. All right, the crescendo moment, the motivations that we design. And like any good 30-minute presentation, I'm going to force millennia of study around motivational design into about 2 minutes. Just for the purpose of this, let's agree that there are 5 components to motivational design. There are extrinsic and intrinsic factors. There's direction, which is the goal that you're heading towards. There's intensity, the amount of energy that you're going to put into achieving that goal. And there's persistence, ultimately a factor of duration. Again, if you're in that setup of being a service provider or a vendor to another customer, or even if you're in a business unit and you conduct your business in a way that makes you a service provider to other areas of the business, I'd love to hear after this talk in the panel section what kind of activities you undertake to consider the fit between your customers' motivations and your own. If we're going to go into partnership with a customer, it's definitely our responsibility to be thinking about what their motivations are, what our own are, and designing a way for the two to converge. If there is an impossibility for the two to converge, we really must have the courage to walk away from the engagement. In order to put in place a framework that helps us think about understanding motivations and leads us toward the path of designing in ways that we can converge and negotiate. I think of it in this kind of cyclical fashion, that through those early engagement conversations, we're really trying to listen for what a customer's motivations are. In understanding what their motivations are, or circling closer to understanding, we're looking at ways that we can identify what our standards are and whether our standards can be met through their motivations, and whether we can design some level of convergence through the two. That sets us up for thinking about how we can begin negotiating, coming back to the conversation and talking about where there might originally be a mismatch and how we can get aligned. And then recognizing the very reality that sometimes there is a need to compromise, but how can we be strategic on our compromise? And I'll walk through some of the questions and the thought processes that we might go through in order to achieve this. Really, this is about a conversation in objection handling. We will always need to handle objections. And again, very interested to hear what kind of objections you typically hear. 3 that I've chosen that are relevant to our world is objection 1 being the customer that we're interfacing with saying something like that we've worked with end users and have incorporated their feedback into these requirements, and therefore we don't need any additional help. Objection 2, we can't give you access to frontline staff because they're too busy and they won't have opinions. Brave is the person who says such a thing. And objection 3 being something to the effect of, this is a technical request only, so we don't need to involve anyone else. For any of those objections, this is just our starting point. And if I just pick up the first one of, we've worked with end users and we've incorporated their feedback into these requirements, what I'm really trying to listen for as they're saying such things, and this is obviously a very protracted conversation, around their motivations is, what are they actually expressing? And what am I detecting in what's being stated? Are they really saying that they're on a schedule, that there's a very hard stop? And if that's the case, what really does that hard stop require to be proven? Knowing that we have those standards in place, those 6 AI principles and the standards that we derive from those, where can we find areas that we can converge on? If the customer wants to do something fast and we want to do something right, is there a way for the two to converge? As we're starting to discuss the convergence and we're getting prepared to go in for negotiation, we really have to frame our objectives, frame where we want to get to in the language of their emotional drivers. And those emotional drivers can only really be discovered through the first step of having a conversation and beginning to distill the motivating factors. And as I mentioned, there will always be a need to compromise. But if you're in this business for a considerable amount of time and you have enough information to be able to start storming through all of the possible objections you have heard or hear of, you can begin that process of starting to prioritize your objections. What are the things that you absolutely will not falter on versus what are things that you could potentially compromise on in order to create strategic leverage in the future? What I mean by that is in the objection area number 2 around frontline staff, we'll often hear from a customer that while we can't access frontline staff, we can access managers of frontline staff. And what typically happens is through the research process and the discovery process, there will inevitably be sound bites that result from that research that strengthens and makes a very compelling case back to the project group as to why frontline staff need to be engaged with. And there's nothing more compelling than using the words and the arguments from an organization's own people in order to open access to people who we actually have to interact with. So that's an example of what I would refer to as strategic leverage and strategic compromise. You do one thing that's a little suboptimal to what you would like to do, but you're doing it in the hope and in the belief that it will then get you a step closer to what you need to do. I'm going to end all of this with something that I say with some hint of reservation, and the reservation is contained in the fact that so much more needs to be understood about different cultures, both at a country level and even within organizations, to know when this is the right strategy to employ. And the suggestion is to lead conversations with statements of what you expect, not requests. I'll light this up with a very small example of how I would come to the table in a conversation leading with a statement where I might say to a customer, okay, to get started, we need to map those likely to be impacted by this work. And we need to start with a research piece in which they're involved. So let's get started with the mapping. And the customer would typically, with that kind of directive, respond with, okay, well, what do we need to do? As opposed to a conversation where I would be tentative, or I'm hearing someone else be tentative, where they would say, is it possible to get access to some of the frontline people? To which you're leaving the door open for a no. And the customer in that instance is likely to say, oh, actually, they're likely to put their own motivations ahead and say, actually, we've already collected the requirements, pace, and our frontline people don't have time, paternalistic. So you can see how two conversations wanting the very same outcome achieve very different outcomes because of the way that the conversation was designed. So we started at the beginning of this discussion, or the monologue as it is, asking the question, why is it hard and who makes it hard to access people who will be impacted by technology? And I wonder if that after we reflect on our involvement and what we could possibly do to change things up, that if it's hard, maybe we need to experiment designing some different approaches. And perhaps part of who makes it hard is ourselves. Maybe there are things that we could do to make it a little less hard. My name is Bujuanes Livermore. There is most definitely always more that we can do. And I hope that you, like us, are part of the change that we need when it comes to digital and technology projects. Many thanks. Very much looking forward to hearing what's worked for you in the panel discussion afterwards.
All right, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And I have a few questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
The first one, overall, what I've taken from your whole talk is that I could almost unpack every little aspect that you've done and ask you to do a presentation on that. It's just fascinating. I'll break it down with the first, earlier on in your talk, you mentioned about vendors, and you work in the center of those between both the vendor and Microsoft. A lot of companies would be in the same boat. The majority of companies these days have in some form vendors that they work with. How do you manage the customer in that equation? How do you get across the depth of knowledge that Microsoft would have to that vendor in order for them to do their job, and the customer to be at the heart of it?
Yeah, well, I think that last part of your sentence is the goal and has to be the shared objective. The customer has to be at the heart of that. And there will inevitably be conversations and meetings that have to be had between Microsoft and vendors. But I would say in the work that I personally have undertaken with vendors, I have incredible respect for the amount of talent that vendors hire and the approaches. I mean, these are serious businesses in an industry that's worth a lot of money. Microsoft's ecosystem generally provides a lot of support and training for people in order to be at the level of skill that they need to be when it comes to vendors. But I guess you're kind of ultimately alluding to the fact that there is additional engagement management required when it's not just you providing a service to a customer, but you're also then needing to work with a range of other people in order to light up that service. And that's kind of, I guess the essence is hidden a little bit in that sentence. Yes, there's a role in and of itself around engagement management for all parties. An area that we have within Microsoft commercial software engineering has a role that is very much focused on doing that. The role is a technical project manager, and that's abbreviated to a TPM. That TPM is most definitely a crucial linchpin to all of the stakeholders that would be helping a customer at a point in time.
Fantastic. And just on those, that technical lead, do they supply documentation that's standardized throughout Microsoft, or would it be unique for each vendor? What does the onboarding process look like?
Do they provide documentation to the customer or to the vendor?
To the vendor.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not best positioned to talk about the legalities, but that question does, when I'm hearing that question, I'm kind of moving toward that being a conversation that's around the legalities in the, firstly around the selection process of the vendor, and then the engagement, the working agreement between the vendor and the customer. So I know enough to know that is not my forte, and therefore I would direct that question to the legal part of Microsoft to provide very clear and very accurate answers on. But generally, yes, there is a number of activities and there's paperwork involved in that entire process, both with customers and with our partners. We actually refer to them as partners, Microsoft partners.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I can just imagine just the size of Microsoft and doing all that would be so complex. So it's just fascinating because it comes up as such a challenge for the industry. And the fact that you're kind of sitting there in the heart of it is just really interesting. I want to also now move on to the GDPR and the data and the human element of our data. Data is so important to everybody, and it's been jeopardized, is the only word for it. What is the future of data sharing? Is it GDPR like Europe has done, or is it something else?
The future of data sharing, I guess if we look at GDPR, the essence of that conversation has been around ensuring that people have a right over their data. However, we're at a point in time where big changes in technology can only happen through a sharing of data. And that's a really fascinating model, because if you think about an organization that has for a long time, not Microsoft, any organization in its respective industry, knowledge and data was power for them in their industry. But we're now looking at a moment in time where, in fact, combined data becomes, dare I say, power, but for when that data is brought together for the good of something, can become quite game-changing. For example, APRA had, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, had released a standard earlier in the year or last year around banks needing to model the way in which their portfolios could be affected if a natural disaster hit Australia. It would be really cost inefficient if those organisations needed to collect their own data around all possible natural disasters and undertake machine learning modelling in order to make such predictions. What would be more efficient and therefore is better financially for the end consumer, i.e. people who are bank account holders, would be if the industry got together and shared a collective data set around possible natural disasters, and then undertook their modelling on that shared data set. So I can see in some areas how there is, that's just one example, many more examples, particularly in health and life sciences, where the need to combine data and the need to just to actually look and question as to whether that history of faculties when it comes to science, with faculties or in health and life science or pharmaceutical companies have controlled certain data sets, whether that's really for the good of everyone, or if we now need to emerge from that period and think very differently about it if we're to kind of get to the next level.
Yeah, fantastic. And I have a final question here, and it's kind of taking on from the positives that you've just been talking at, and that's on AI. Is it as easy as taking, so we talk about diversity and race and sexual orientation, everything. Is it as easy as just removing the human element for AI in order to be more fair? Is it as simple as that? And is there any positives in the future for us?
I'm not sure that the word simple and AI could be in the same sentence together. I think it's a bit of an oxymoron. If we're removing the human element, what's the purpose of AI? If we're to say that AI is about looking at ways in which to augment and improve experiences of something, if it's not augmenting and improving the experiences of humans, what is its purpose? So I think we could, gosh, yet another talk that we could think of. Where is it most beneficial versus, and in it being most beneficial, for whom is it most beneficial? So many things that we could spin off from that. But what I really love about the question is that it gets us it forces people into thinking about data, essentially, and where that data has come from. And I really encourage, I don't get any royalties for this, by the way, very much encourage for people interested in this space to read Kate Crawford's book on Atlas of AI, in which there's an entire chapter about data. And it's written in a way that is very elegantly defining or describing the fact that without questioning data, and for us to default thinking that only technologists or only data scientists should be in that process of questioning data, it's that alone that will exacerbate the problems in the world, because that's exactly what AI does. It requires data to be ingested in order for a model to then spin out what the general consensus of that data is. And unless we really are careful about the model that we're feeding, the data that we're feeding into that model, we will inevitably, guaranteed, be perpetuating the problems that data is already suggesting.